Oh,
How are you doing?
Good, good. How are you? What will seat? Okay. Hi, how are you?
It'd probably be good to sit up front row.
Lined up there?
Oh, mine up.
Well, right now, I'm just trying to get better.
Yeah.
About the mental health thing. So, that's
Yeah.
right now, more for the parents.
Yes.
So, that's
I
my
couldn't,
totally in line.
I know, I couldn't even say that in front of her because she was gonna.
Okay, okay, so you're not surprised?
I'm not.
Okay.
No, we still want everything to be nice. I understand because that, we're all benefit better. But.
No, it's so
Right. Yeah, well, good for you. Right, right. Yeah.
It's 9 o'clock.
But
I just mention it?
Yeah, yeah. I can never say it like this. No. Yeah. I think it's important. Right. I think it's important.
Good morning. We want to take as much time as possible to be able to have you weigh in on a lot of these issues, so we're going to get started right away. We're live streaming this, which is why I have to use the microphone and kind of stay up here. And then secondly, we're doing this type of event again up in St. Cloud next week. So we've got our northern contingent heading up that direction. So I'm really glad everybody took the time. And I hope you all, Laura, did you want to say welcome? No, I hope you all know Laura Lovedoll. She's our executive director. And she keeps the wheels on the bus here. So. Today, this is actually, I sat back and thought, this is the 13th time I've done this. I remember doing this in 2004 in a fire station in White Bear Lake. And some of the similarities are really kind of scary. So, but there have been some terrific changes. So what we've got today is, something is not working with this. Oh, please, stop. Hang on, guys. I'm sorry. You know, why is it when you do this stuff beforehand it works and then it doesn't? Maybe frozen. Talk amongst yourselves. Yeah, the screen's frozen. Sorry, folks. I'll just come around and take your picture. Thank you. The thing to remember and keep in mind this entire session is that it's a really short session and it is absolutely 100% election centered. So anything that happens, you have to realize that people are doing the political calculus as to how it's going to play out in the election. This is particularly important in a presidential year, and it's particularly important because every single senator and every single representative, their seat is up for re-election. So this is a huge year. It doesn't happen a lot. So when it happens, it's important that every one of these representatives has something to door knock with. And so that changes the entire political tenor of what's happening. So that anything that happens, see it with that filter. How can you make it such that it plays out well in the election? Just so that you know, Minnesota, is the birthplace of Parents United. We're Minnesota born. People ask often if there are others of these or a national. This is it. We're it. We often get calls from other states asking us how we do this. So we're Minnesota born and we're parent led, and we exist to unite those who value public education and help you be stronger advocates so that we can have excellent public schools. Our agenda is really simple. We don't speak for you. We make that very, very clear. What we try and do is translate complex terms and what's happening and help you understand where your voice can be best heard. That's what we do. We're often asked to speak for parents, and that's something that we say, no, we're not going to. If you want to talk with parents, we'll help you get to the parents. You may have heard that Minnesota has a state budget surplus, so I think it's important to wander through this one. Last year, they had a budget surplus of about $1.4 billion, and they could not make a decision on how to spend all of that money. So they took $865 million and left it on the table for use this year, the second year of the biennium, which is considered usually a bonding year. That, in November, that number burgeoned to $1.2 billion. All of a sudden, revenues were coming in faster than they expected, so they thought that they would have more money on the table to work with. But in February, that number came back to $900 million. So actually, they're about back to square one. So that's an important component to remember, that they don't have this $1.2 billion. They basically have the same amount of money that they had when they walked out there last year. So a lot of people are thinking that this $900 million is in addition to that $800, and it's not. So you now understand better than most. There's a really good article. Some of you may know Jeff Van Wyken used to work for MIN 2020. He was also a policy person for the Dayton office administration. He also worked before that a lot for Minneapolis Public Schools. He is a finance wonk. He has a really nice article. They just started this organization called North Star Policy Institute. And what he's done is he's laid out the case for investment versus tax cuts. And he does it in a very, very interesting way. This is worth reading, so we've put it in there. His work is really excellent. So it's important to understand the surplus, and this is what Jeff's article does. In the early 2000s, there was a deal struck. Everybody was running for governor at the time, and they had a fairly large budget deficit. So they figured what they would do is to factor inflation in when they were figuring out how much money was coming into the state, but they would not use inflation when they were figuring expenditures. So that's exactly as you would think. Next year, you're going to assume that you're going to get a 5% increase on your salary. But you have to also assume that you are not going to have any increase in your expenses. That's what that means. Your gas isn't going to go up, your utility isn't going to go up, your rent isn't going to go up, your car payments are not going to go up. Everything's going to stay flat. That means you have a surplus. That's what the state does. And the state does this every single time and has since 2000. And it was a legislative deal struck. So Minnesota's very unique that it factors inflation only when it assumes what money is coming in, but doesn't factor it when they send it out. Does everybody get that? Because that's really important. Okay, well, some people, our last governor used to say, if you factored inflation on expenditures, it would be the government on autopilot. So in other words, if you assumed next year you were going to have an inflation of inflation runs at about 2% a year, 1 or 2%. So you figure next year our healthcare costs are going to cost another 1%. That governor believed that just meant that we were going to willy-nilly say we're going to expend more money next year. So there was a difference between reality. So this is a very unique system, and what it means to the real people who are working the nuts and bolts, that $900 million is actually already spent. It's not surplus. It's exactly as your paycheck coming in and thinking you're getting more money, but you don't have to expend more. So this is what the leadership wants to do with the surplus. This is what we've heard. So our ear has been to the ground since these forecasts came out in November and then again in February. So what we've heard is the Senate Majority Leader, Tom Bach, says if it's a surplus fund, so you've got money here, you should use it for one-time funding. Because the surplus may not be there next year. That's his thinking. So you should use it one time and fund one-time things. Can you think of something that would be a one-time fund? Something that would be one-time funding?
Capital stuff?
Capital, that's bonding. But in schools, if you have a project that you want done or a program just this year, that would be one-time funding. But to pay for a teacher, that would be an ongoing expense. So Bach says just use it for one-time funding. Speaker of the House Doubt, so this is the other side, he says ongoing tax credits or tax cuts. This is what they did in the early 2000s under Jesse Ventura. You remember Jesse checks. Those were one-time funders because you only got them in 1 year. But then they also cut taxes for commercial, business, industrial, and those were ongoing. What Kirk Doubt has said is he wants to make it so that no one pays taxes on Social Security income. Now tell me who gets Social Security income?
Over 65 disabled.
Absolutely, over 65 disabled, but the majority of people who live on social, so why is it, why would that be a good thing to do in an election year? Who votes more than anybody? Oh, me, old people, always, absolutely, that's true. But the other thing is that most people who live on Social Security, plus it makes sense, doesn't it? Oh, probably old, so, Social Security. Okay, here's the deal. Most people who live on Social Security don't pay income tax because their income is too low. Who then would pay income tax on Social Security? Those who don't need it. Those who it's extra money. Those on top of their pensions, on top of their investments, on top of something else. So who are they really saying shouldn't pay tax?
Oh, people who can.
Exactly. But this is really important to understand. This is how they want to spend the money. So you've got the Senate saying, spend the money in one-time funding because we don't know if it's going to be there. You've got the House saying, no, we can afford and should afford ongoing tax credits. When Ventura did ongoing tax credits, and actually he wasn't the one who wanted the ongoing tax credits, but the legislature did, what ended up happening is for the next 9 out of 10 years, Minnesota had deficits. And everybody wondered why. Yeah, I mean, you give ongoing tax credits with one-time money, you're going to dig yourself a hole. So we're in exactly the same position as we were. And the decision is exactly the same. And it, by the way, is at a time when this major election is coming up. And don't forget about the election. One other thing that's important about the election, not only do you have to get elected, but you want the nominee from your party, in most cases, elected. So you want to turn out as many voters as you can. Okay, last session's major sticking point was transportation. Dayton and Bach wanted to fund it with a gas tax, and Kurt Doubt wanted to fund it using the surplus. Now, interestingly enough, you see the gas tax? What happened? Gas was at an all-time high at first, and people are like, you can't possibly tax gas. It's that much more. You can't do that. You can't do that. Well, now gas is at an all-time low. So, and they wanted to pay for transportation, roads, bridges, and transit with this money. This is going to be the sticking point again, because the House wants to spend the surplus on transportation and ongoing funding, ongoing tax cuts. Now imagine how that's going to play out. This is the latest poll of the use of the surplus. This is what the GOP, who were surveyed, said. Refund it. The red is spend it, and the green is save it. The DFL, you can see it's the exact opposite, independent voters, and then the state as a whole. So we are really pretty evenly split on do you refund it? Do you save it? And do you spend it? And again, is the surplus a real surplus? That's the crux of all of this. We're arguing about how to spend money that actually is non-existent. Okay, and if you were to invest it, this is what the poll says. First and foremost on roads, and notice it says roads, it didn't say transit. It does say roads, and K-12. That's where they would spend the money. The overarching 2016 issue, we already talked about the November election. Your job is to gain or retain the majority. That is your job. Absolutely dead on, period. You get your spot and you make sure you keep in the majority because the majority matters. The second thing that they do is pass a bonding bill. Only once in the since 1962 have they not passed a bonding bill. That was 2004. A bonding bill is all the capital things that you want. If the state owns a building, it has to be a state-owned building, and it needs refurbishing or maintenance, or if you may need to build a new building, then you put that in the bonding bill. That's the university, state-owned buildings. But the real thing is that this is the pie sweetener. This is the pie sweetener. You try and balance regional. So you get something in Grand Rapids, you get something in Albert Lee, you get something in St. Paul, you get something. So they have to do that. Then they have to make sure that people have it in their parties. Enough for Republican Party, enough for It is a true interesting bill. And they do this because it's the only one that requires a supermajority vote. They need 3/5 of these guys to vote yay on this. 3/5 of them. That's a lot. But that's the legislature works in a 2-year biennium. The first year they balance the budget, which is what they did last year. The second year tends to be a bonding year. This bill by the DFL is called a jobs bill because if you build infrastructure, you do create jobs. And the GOP tends to say it's a spending bill. That's the way they'll talk about it. The Real ID Act has to be acted on. You may understand you have a license. And starting next year, you won't be able to fly with just your license. You're going to need your passport. So because Minnesota, and there's a lot of good reason for this, Minnesota, the federal government said we have to have enhanced IDs, enhanced licenses. Well, an enhanced license, my daughter just applied for one. It takes, she had to have 2 years of tax returns. She had to have pieces from her utility bill showing that she had paid her utility at that home for X amount. She had to have her birth certificate, her social security, the whole 9 yards. Because the idea is if you fly on your license, they should have all that information. That's from the federal government. Minnesota resisted that because that would mean too few people would be able to get a base license that they need to drive a car. So there's going to have to be some resolution on that. You're going to hear a lot about that, and it's going to bring in the whole idea of new citizens, undocumented workers, people who can't afford it. It's a huge deal. You're going to hear a lot about this. And then the use of their transportation dollars. We've already seen some want it, or use of their surplus dollars. Some want it for transportation, some want it for tax cuts. In the last 3 weeks, these two phrases have been coming up, which I find interesting. Spend it on racial disparities.
Dreaming more?
And spend it on education achievement gap. These are the first times in 20 years that I've heard these phrases used. I'm not quite sure how they do this, but they're talking about spending the surplus on these items. So specifically for education, it's important to know that the federal government did pass the ESSA Act. ESSA, in 1965, the federal government did the Elementary and Secondary School Education Act. It was meant to help disadvantaged kids who are living in poverty, kids who are challenged. Every 5 years, that bill is reauthorized at the federal government. The last time it was reauthorized, whomever is president at the time gets to sign it and name it, and have a lot to do with the direction. The last one was No Child Left Behind. It languished long beyond its reauthorization date and finally was just signed into law on December 10th, 2015 by President Obama, and now it's called the Every Student Succeeds Act. There have been some changes, and they tout that there's a lot of changes here that each state would do. And in the back by Anne, we have probably the foremost resource on the closest thing with ESSA that can tell you what it has about accountability and assessment. So you may want to look at those. But first, we know that it still requires annual statewide testing. So that didn't change. Most people were hoping for that. And at this point, the state, no one can really tell you everything that's in it, because what happens when a law passes is then they look at the Department of Education to create rules around how to actually implement it. So that's the process we're in. We're awaiting the rule-making process by the Department of Education. It's going to be expedited, which means it's got to be done quickly, but ESSA takes place in 2018. So we have 1 year to put this in shape. So I think it brings some interesting possibilities for Minnesota, and I think that's something we need to pay attention to. Though it still requires annual testing and the use of test scores for accountabilities, it does ask for goals for long-term student achievement and the 4-year graduation rates. So some of that is the same, some of it's a little different. You guys, you're writing like crazy. Please, you can have this PowerPoint. I will just send it to anyone who wants it. We can just send it to everybody. Please, don't, you make me nervous. Listen instead of writing. But further ESA requires, this is where I think we have an ace in the hole. It actually states that students are to be given a well-rounded education. So we can always be starting to talk about the fact that this is well-rounded per ESSA. The other thing that it does that I think opens the door for us, interesting. There's still intervention and support for struggling schools. You still have to identify schools for targeted reform based on performance of, they're still using the phrase subgroups, guys. We got to stop that. Protected populations, there are much better words for it, but the law still does use that word. And the assessment of 95% of students. I'm not sure how they're going to deal with that with the opt-out. But here, use of Title I funding, 7%. So Title I funding comes from the federal government and is tied to this bill. And it's supposed to go to struggling students. But now they're saying 7% of those dollars. So they're not increasing the dollars, but now they're putting more constraints on it. 7% have to be spent for school improvement activities, and 3% for direct student services, specifically to have AP and IB, career and tech ed, leading to credentials, credit recovery, personalized learning. What they're trying to do with this is they're trying to get directly to students to help them transition to college and career readiness. So they're trying to take children, this is the first time this has been done, it's interesting. They're trying to take students who have been challenged or struggling and transition them into a credentialed program so that they can have a job, or high-level classes so that it improves. We always know that we've got a very, very over-identified group of affluent students in AP and IB, and a very, very few students who are challenged in AP and IB. So this is going to be a challenge, but money is going away, and it's got to be used in a different way. So that's...
When you say challenge, you mean socioeconomically challenged?
But it's also academically. It's academic and socio. Yeah.
So if you normally don't get Title I funding, you will get Title I funding?
No.
Oh.
First and foremost, you have to qualify for Title I, and then of your Title I dollars that you have had in the past, now you have to spend it this way.
What was it before?
It was freer. It still had to go to the student, but it wasn't as specified. What really this talks about school improvement activities. It's supposed to directly to the student, but this one is interesting to me only because it's trying to ask you very specifically to get kids who are living in poverty in AP and IB classes or credentialed programs. That has never been asked for, so that's rather interesting. How it impacts Minnesota. The federal law I think, first off, it allows us to reconfigure our multiple measurement rating system. This may be in the weeds, but in 2011, Minnesota wanted to get out of No Child Left Behind. And to do that, we applied for and received a waiver. And by applying for and receiving that waiver, we were able to do different things in Minnesota than other states were able to do. And what they required of us was to devise an accountability system, and we did it, called the MMR. And what it was before the MMR, a school was either reached proficiency or not. You were either yes on AYP or no. That was it. That was the accountability system. So you take all your schools and you go, they all met, including all protected populations. Everybody. Minnesota said that's crazy. So what the MMR did is said, all right, let's see how many kids are proficient. If it's a high school, how many kids are graduated? That's the same. But then they added, how fast is the growth? Are kids growing fast enough to be able to catch up? And what are schools doing to close achievement gaps? So our rating system was based on growth, how well our kids were doing. Well, we have a chance to make that a little better. One of the ways is we can add school quality improvement indicator measures. What would be something you'd want to add to a rating? Besides test scores. This opens the door. You know, it still has to be measured. Some people are saying, what is the opportunity for students to be able to take APIB courses? What are the opportunities for students to have extracurricular activities? What is the school climate like? What are what is the suspension rate like? I mean, Minnesota can add other indicators here to start really showing what the schools are doing. That's an open door as far as I'm concerned, and we're pushing, along with a lot of other groups, to reform this MMR, because when we did it, it was very tightly confined and we had to apply for and receive a waiver. This gives us a lot more freedom, so we should jump on this. The other thing it allows us to do, this MMR that we've been using, that's for the federal government. Then we passed in the state the world's best workforce. No one's ever aligned those because we haven't been allowed to. This is very, very interesting because the world's best workforce really requires family engagement, very specifically. So I think this is interesting. They could also mean potential test scores, test changes. High schools may use nationally recognized assessments instead of, we have the MCAs. You can use ACTs or SATs to fulfill this. Too bad Minnesota had them, repealed them. I'd like to push back for having them again, but when we had them, the problem where the kids had to take MCAs and ACTs. Now we could simply throw out the MCAs at the high school level and have all kids take SATs or ACTs, which I think is a much better thing. You take an MCA in Minnesota and you go to Ohio to go to school and somebody says, well, who cares? What's an MCA? But you have an SAT or an ACT and you go to Ohio, it's a ticket. It's a ticket to your college. This is a good thing. And a lot of people forget that you can get into colleges with an ACT score of 13, as long as you have the score. Plus that score lasts for 10 years. So maybe at 18 you don't want to go to school, but maybe at 26 you do. And then Minnesota's already done this. States can set a target limit on the aggregate amount of time spent on testing. Minnesota did that last year. No more than 2% of time can be spent on testing in the school. That's a district test. And it doesn't include AP or IB.
And that doesn't include test prep.
And it does not include test prep. So a lot of people are like, big deal. Okay, but you're going to hear more about that. So, but much of the things that could make a difference are going to need legislative authority. And if they don't overtly need legislative authority, guaranteed the legislature will want to weigh in. This is the one last thing I'll say about ESSA. It allows for an innovative assessment pilot. So 7 states or a consortium of 4 states can get together and they can determine a new accountability system and a new assessment system. And these tests can use competency or performance-based tests, so no more bubble tests. They could actually, I hate to say this because people have bad feelings about it, but can think about profile of learning. Performance-based. We could go back to that.
I don't have bad feelings.
Well, a lot of people had a bad feeling. And then if you do that, you're released from the annual state testing. So a lot of people are saying, can we test across bands? So in other words, 3, 4, 5, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. Could you do a performance-based test for kids somewhere in that band and then use that for accountability? In this innovative pilot, I'm thinking that's what it says. That just opens some interesting doors for us. So instead of being constantly locked in, this is pretty interesting. What we're hearing, this is what we're hearing from different education groups. The Senate has been meeting since the early part of January, and the House has not met, but the House allows for pre-filed bills. So there's a whole list of pre-filed bills, nothing earth-shattering. One's earth-shattering. Not a lot of earth-shattering, and then the Senate has been meeting. So both give you kind of a window into what they're thinking. The session's going to be about 10 weeks. The policy committee in the House will meet 7 times. That's it. That's really short. So we'll see if there's even a policy bill. But what we're hearing from the education organizations, pretty much there's general support for money on the formula.
Mary, can you just time for 1 second? Some of those organizations, this is the teachers union, this is the the principals association, the school board association. I just wanted to get a picture of who all these actors are.
Education Minnesota, Minnesota Association of School Administrators, the Association of Metropolitan School Districts, Schools for Equity in Education, Minnesota Rural Education Association, the Association Minnesota Elementary School Principals Association, the Secondary School Principals Association, all of those groups. So they're all tend to be school employees, administrators. So they want money on the formula. That's a perennial request. They want to reduce special ed cross-subsidy. That's the cost that we have to pay because neither the state nor the federal government is paying what they promised to pay. It's not just the feds. Don't let them get away with that. The state is also not paying what they have promised to pay. They prorate it depending on how much money they have left in the coffers. Debt service and referendum equalization, another money item that helps schools. Now this is interesting. They want to expand QComp. Remember, quality compensation, pay for performance, that's when it first came through under Palenti. And eliminate, there's a cap on how many districts can have it. The reason that everybody's wanting to do this, and the thing that has been most successful with QComp, is the way that it's really helped with teacher evaluation. That's really the deal that people are most interested in. And I'm going to get this number wrong by $10, I think. QComp provides about $260 per student in the districts that have gone into our QComp districts. All the rest of them, according to law, this year got $240 per teacher to do the teacher development and evaluation. That's a big difference. So most people are trying to use this mechanism to get more money to help with teacher development and evaluation. I'm not sure that's the right mechanism, but that's what a lot of people are asking. They're saying it's in law, just expand it, put more money into it. Expand school-based pre-K, and everybody was very specific about that. School-based pre-K. And teacher recruitment and retention. This is probably the biggest issue, and this one drives me right over the edge. Everybody is walking out there saying, how did we get a teacher shortage? How is that possible? We beat the bejesus out of these people for 20 years. We say that they're the ones that have caused achievement gaps. We do everything we can to destroy them. And then we put kids in colleges with inflated tuitions who come out and we say, why aren't you taking a job for $30,000 a year that has absolutely no prestige and will beat you? How is that possible? No, serious, I'm dead serious. This is what people are saying. How is it possible that they're really? Take a look at the mirror. There's a lot of desire to increase teachers of color and in hard to fill areas and disciplines. This is both regionally and also disciplines. And oh, by the way, guess what the disciplines are? They've always been special ed and science and math, yes. But guess what the biggest ones are now? This is another one that drives me crazy. Career and tech. Well, I wonder why that happened. I mean, all we did was test math and reading for how many years? To such an extent that schools that did have deep, good tech programs had to do away with them. And now we're saying, where are all those teachers? Well, they're probably working someplace else. Yes?
Just to learn about the teacher recruitment and retention, is there any discussion around the, it feels like what I hear is we've made it harder to become a teacher, especially for the teachers of color everyone says they want. I mean, with that.
Agreed.
I forget what it's called, but that's.
Well, there's a million different programs, but nobody is putting money or attention to them. I'm saying that this is what people say. I'm getting a little annoyed with simply saying, well, we need to get more teachers of color. Well, what are you going to do? There's some programs, Grow Your Own is really good. We're advocating for one piece, actually. Paul brought it to my attention. It appears that there's a lot of teachers of color who are able to scrape together enough to go and do all the coursework. But when it comes to actually doing the student teaching so that they qualify for the license, that means they would have to give up a full-time job that they need in order to student teach. So they cannot make it that last bit across the line. So why aren't we doing stipends for teachers of color to be able to student teach? That's something we're asking for. We're also asking for loan forgiveness. It was done many, 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 many years ago in many, many states to increase the number of men at one point in teaching. It's often been done that you do loan forgiveness as a way to get people who want to go to college. Their loan is forgiven if they teach for X amount of years, 5, 6, 7 years. That's possible. There's Grow Your Own programs. There's some programs that I have seen to hold harmless your teachers of color in your contract, so that even though they are, last hired, they are held harmless if teachers have to be let go. That's a district thing. So there's a lot of different ways to go about this. Yeah.
How are they defining color? That's my question. Diverse background?
No, and that's a great question. Color was always defined into the 60s as black, and nobody wanted to say it. But African American, we need a lot of Latinos. That's a huge area that we need. We need Hmong teachers. We need teachers who, let's put it this way, non-white would be a better way to put this. They call it teachers of color, but we should say non-white.
But I guess my main thing is, the one thing I don't like about the word color, and I know there's nothing you can do about it, but it's the fact that a lot of people do look at the word color as black people. I mean, that's just the way people perceive it, that's the way people get it. And also by saying that, then you're leaving out even diverse background, because there's people that may be white, but they're not technically your normal American citizen, that type of thing, where they could.
I absolutely agree with you. We have so many biracial people now in this country. I think you're going to see this change in the next 5 years. So I think it means non-traditional, non-white is what we're talking about. Paul?
The state has 30% students of color and 4% teachers of color, American Indian teachers. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, where there's 75% students of color, it's only 15% teachers of color. So there's a big gap. There is a House bill that just has been finalized, and looking for authorship on teachers of color, American Indian teachers. It'll be introduced next week regarding the Coalition to Increase Teachers of Color platform. A couple of things that you mentioned, Mary. I've got forms here and a petition if anybody's interested.
Excellent.
joining the coalition.
So there is a coalition to actually do something. There's a bill. Paul was telling us there's a bill that's going to be introduced next week, and he has more information about it. We would like that information, please, and we will send it out as well. That's the kind of thing that we're looking for, is an actual, what could actually happen with that. So, but this, I have to say, now it's in everyone's lexicon. They understand the need for it. Plus, also, there are two other things about this. By 2025, Minnesota, the minority, what's called minority in our K-12 system, what's now called minority, will be the majority. That's in 2025. So we're looking at 9 years, and yet the teachers that we have all look like what is now the majority. So we're looking at a decade of a total change, and we need leaders from non-white communities to bring us into that time. We need them in our schools. The other thing I wanted to tell you is there's this, it was an amazing testimony by this gentleman, the African American Registry, that has curriculum for non-white students. And that's what we're finding. Students learn when they're engaged. If the curriculum does not reflect them, they will not be engaged. I mean, it's kind of cyclical. Okay?
Mary, last year.
In order for our live stream people to hear, we have to hand the mic to our questioner. Sorry.
Does that second mic work?
Well, but I don't, is it going to be a question, Kay, or a comment?
A comment. Last year, I observed our finance and our social policy committees at the legislature. Hardly any person of color was in the room except Brenda Casilius. And I looked up the census for all the legislators on the committees. And very few of them have students of color like we do in Richfield or Minneapolis. And so we have to change the legislators' attitude about caring about our kids of color in Minnesota.
It's starting to work. And mental health and support staff is getting to be a lot. But what people don't understand is they can't figure out how to do this. So they're looking at saying you need to add X amount of counselors, but they don't fund it. And all that means is that if you have to add 3 counselors, then you have to do it within the dollars you have. So that means 3 teachers are gone. I mean, that's what's been happening. So be very careful when people say things like that. So we need to make sure that the funding is there. Minnesota is the 49th or the 50th in the state, dependent on which number you look at. 792-1 is the student counselor ratio in Minnesota. So. Okay, individually, there are a variety of legislative issues you should be aware of. Expansion of full-service community schools is really growing. These are schools that have full wraparound services. There's pilot with 4 of them right now. Choice through tax credits, that's coming back up again. In other words, you can take your tax credit and go anywhere. One of the things that is interesting about the scholarships for pre-K is that we've developed an entire population now that are used to taking a scholarship and going to a school of choice for their preschools. What's going to change their minds when they go to a kindergarten and first grade? So some people have, pardon?
That's a voucher.
Well, your word, they said choice through tax credits. Easier for teachers from out of state to be licensed in Minnesota. This is what Sarah was talking about. This is a real hot button item. At this point, if the law passes the way it is or continues the way it is, it will be harder for teachers in Minnesota to get a teaching license than if you left Minnesota, taught for a nonprofit for 2 years, and came in as a fully licensed teacher. Somehow or other, this isn't working well. Funding for alternative teacher programs. This is part of this again. There's this big push, and it's happening. The convergence is happening at exactly the time there's a major teacher shortage. I heard someone from a rural area say, I don't care where the teacher comes from, I just need somebody in my classroom. I do care where the teacher comes from. I do care what their license is. So we've got to really get this thing right. A reconfiguration of the Board of Teaching. This is kind of where people are heading. This is where it has to be changed. This particular bill that was dropped makes it much, much smaller. And it also makes the teachers on it not have to actually be teachers in the classroom now. So it's an interesting bill. Public report card for teacher prep institutions based on teacher performance. So this is more of the testing. So you test, and then you follow the kids who have had the tests, and you follow the teachers they've had, and then you follow the teacher back to their college of preparation, and you grade the college of preparation on how well they graded, how well they taught the teacher to teach the kids to do the test. It feels like a children's book. That's something that's, again, coming up. Drastic changes in dismissal policies. This is the school to prison pipeline. Again, it's something that people are, really, it is over-identified kids in suspension, all this. What happens? What do we do? Where do we go? And again, if all you have is a hammer, which is all legislation is, it can't be a scalpel, it's just going to come straight down and say, you must not suspend, or you must not do this, or you must not. And that's, so some of these bills will be around that area. I think we have to be aware of that. And then staff up the regional centers of excellence. I've been out front on this one all along. Regional centers of excellence, there are 6 of them in the state. The idea is to decentralize the services that the Minnesota Department of Education can give to schools. So, right now they have 1 person at each school, in each regional center. And the idea is, could we have people at these various centers that have some expertise in various areas that those schools and teachers are looking for? And could we possibly make that happen? And here, Rachel, would you get up and talk a little bit about what your bill is doing?
Hi, I'm Rachel Berger. I'm chairperson of Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota. We're an advocacy group led by parents, teachers, and other concerned individuals who are advocating for the rights of dyslexic children in our public schools. So the regional centers of excellence and staffing those up is a great area that we feel confident would be an area in which we can serve these children, as well as all children in the state who are struggling with literacy. The desire is to use the regional centers of excellence as a place to start with some trainings and development by using staff that are very deeply trained and highly knowledgeable in the field of literacy and dyslexia specifically, as well as so folks at the regional centers of excellence, I apologize, I wasn't exactly ready, would be highly trained, highly knowledgeable individuals responsible for getting trainings and knowledge into the hands of our teachers who so desire to impact their struggling learners.
Would you give those figures, those numbers, 20%?
So for those of you that don't have knowledge on dyslexia, the impact of dyslexia is the current stats from the National Institute of Health Child Development is that 17 to 20% of our population struggles with dyslexia. Mm-hmm. Yet only 1 in 10 children have a diagnosis for this. And that makes probably 10 out of 100 who receive reasonable accommodations for the disability. Reasonable can be anything from extra time on tests, etc. But really what these kids need, and if you're looking at a classroom, you're talking about 4 to 5 kids that struggles with this, and genuinely the knowledge isn't out there that they're struggling. So they need effective evidence-based instruction. Thanks, ma'am.
And there's a lot of new intervention that we know about that we did not know about, and that's one of the things in education that we don't necessarily turn and find the most innovative, newest information. I know it sounds strange, but it's true. Yeah.
Piggybacking on that, and we did talk briefly Monday at the Senate hearing. You know, our students are screened in elementary school for vision and hearing every year. Why don't they just add dyslexia onto that when you consider the significant number of students that have that? Has there been any advocacy for that to be added for ongoing screening?
We actually have been, Rachel, do you know of any? We have actually been advocating also the 3-year-old screening. We'd like to increase the number of kids who are screened at 3 and make sure that the screening process is sensitive enough to pick up early indicators of any kind of struggling reading, but dyslexia in particular.
So to answer your question, regarding screening, dyslexia is 92% identifiable by the age of 5. And that is one of our mission points as an advocacy group, is to effect policy on early screening and early identification, early appropriate remediation for these kids, so that we don't get into situations where these children aren't being identified until 3rd grade and then they're already 3 years behind. So.
We went to the Minnesota Department of Education, Shauna and I, and talked to them about these screenings. And we've also talked with the Director of Early Education, Early Learning, Melvin Carter, and it appears that there's a program in Minnesota called Help Me Grow, and it's actually incorrectly named because there's a national Help Me Grow program, and they should never have called the one in Minnesota Help Me Grow. And our screening process, small bird walk here, our screening process of our kids from 3 to 5 is to pick out the bottom 4% of kids, the kids who are overtly special needs, because the resolution is then they go into ECSE. That's the intent of that screening. The National Help Me Grow, if they were to come in and screen our kids, they would, so consider it like a funnel. That screening would be like a funnel. It pops out those bottom 4%. What National Helps Me Grow, consider a colander. So now the screening comes and it pops out, and you as a family are able to understand, it's not necessarily normative, but we may not have a resolution, but you can at least start seeking help in X, Y, and Z. That's one of the things we're advocating for, is to bring the National Help Me Grow screening process into Minnesota. It's less than $5 million. So it's really, but that's from Decoding Dyslexia. That's one of the things that we like, is to work with people who are out there trying to do things, help them understand who to talk to, and help us understand issues so that we can also spread the word. That's the whole early childhood screening component that we're looking at. Right now, if you're 3, it's totally up to your school district how many kids are actually screened. And there's tons and tons and tons of 5-year-olds that come to school that have never been screened. That's 2 years we've given up to be able to get these kids help. Yeah, Andrea.
You want me to talk? Oh. I was under the impression that it was all 3-year-olds, and I am on the ICC, so I'm well aware of the Help Me Grow. But all up to, at 3 years old, all Minnesotans are required to be screened between 3 and 5. They cannot enter kindergarten without it.
Correct. That is correct. But the percentage of 3-year-olds versus the percent of 5-year-olds is very small.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, so we could get more 3-year-olds screened.
Right.
So concerns, we have an advisory. Parents United has advisory from around the state, and we ask them, what are you hearing from in your areas? But before we lay this out, do you have concerns going on in your particular districts that you'd like to share? Ann, would you? Ann's like sleeping today. I don't understand this.
I'm Kathleen Tiaden, also with Decoding Dyslexia, and I appreciate the partnership that you're helping us with. Because one thing I wanted to piggyback was the screening is obviously very important, but I have 2 children in Bloomington school districts, and they just don't have, why the regional centers are important, and it's the first step, they just don't have the resources or knowledge, and some of that's, I think, willful, to be honest with you, and some of it's not willful, because I don't think the colleges have prepared teachers to understand dyslexia and how to teach it. I have a kindergartner who's been in RTI the whole year, still doesn't get phonics.
Response to intervention.
Yeah, because they don't loop it. And when you have true dyslexia intervention, it has to be a very looping, intentional, evidence-based approach. And they want to just check off the box and go, oh, they got the alphabet down today, we're done with that. And that's not how you can help a dyslexic. It has to be more intentional and more long-term approach. And that's something that school districts, they haven't been able to grasp. So that's kind of the next phase, and I think that's, so yes, we need to identify, but then our next fight is, what are we going to do once we have them identified?
Now she woke up.
Okay, one, quit picking on Ann.
Sorry.
Two, yeah, I'm gonna. It isn't so much in our school district, but your first bullet point on the previous slide about community service schools, I just really urge caution around that and embracing that, because I feel very strongly that more and more things are being pushed into the schools and not funded or funded with solid funding. You know, these people that, you know, a lot of the districts that have community wrapped schools are using it with grants, partnerships, and those things can pull out any time. And I had an opportunity to meet with my 2 state representatives and talk about a number of issues, and they brought up community, you know, service schools, and I really pushed back on them. I said, you know, we used to teach basic education. Then we brought in sex ed because the kids weren't getting it. Then we brought in character ed. Then we brought in finance ed. And, you know, next thing they're going to say, let's just build dorms and just raise the kids. I really urge caution on embracing the community school concept
Without funding.
Without funding, and ask where is it going to go and when is it going to end.
Isn't that being touted by Ed Minnesota? Isn't community schools, community service schools being touted by Education Minnesota largely right now?
Actually, there's a lot of people who are doing it. So it's the full wrap services. I absolutely agree. Actually, that's one of the reasons that Universal Pre-K had difficulty, because people said that was going to be paid for with surplus dollars, by the way. So it's one-time dollars. Well, and everybody said, so we take on this liability again, and then we don't have the funding to go on. And I will tell you, the 4 community school pilots right now, they've been given $1 million for the 4 of them to just see how it would work. So what I think, as opposed to saying don't go with community schools, because I think these community schools have shown some real promise, not every school, but in many, many areas, but you are exactly right. Unless the funding is there ongoing with the correct, and because funding schools by grants is insane. So we have to push for that. So every time people say, you know, this is a resolution, whatever it is, staff the, you know, RCEs, do the screening, whatever, where's the funding coming from? So I absolutely agree.
And I'm not saying it's not good for the students. It's fabulous.
Correct. But without funding, all it does is put more pressure on our schools to be failures.
So we're letting other people off the hook.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But there are the public health in St. Paul, all of the various components. Shauna, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I think part of the funding question to me is who takes responsibility for that, because what kind of care are we talking about? The growth of students? Are we talking about health care? Are we talking about families and food, services for homeless families? Are we talking about jobs for parents? And when we talk about those things, we should be talking about getting out of our silos and talking about how Department of Health and Human Services is servicing those people, and how the Minnesota Department of Health, along with MDE, can be working together.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's being pushed, but not enough. In other words, I sat and listened to a senator from an education committee say to the Minnesota Department of Education, what are you doing to work better with Department of Health and Human Services? And I wanted to jump up and say, you know what? Your revenue streams to these different agencies come from different committees. What are you doing to make your committees work together to make sure that the funding stream goes and actually pushes the two together? I absolutely, money for community schools, imagine if Department of Health and Human Service paid the component and education paid the component, and that's the way that it's got to be working. So we've got to push for that, but it's interesting because the theory and then the funding in many cases are separated. We're lucky in Minnesota because at the federal government they can pass policy and then and suggest appropriation, but the bill can pass and then it can be brought up in appropriation years later. In Minnesota, you have to match the appropriation with the policy bill, but we have to fight the fiscal note to be more correct than they many times will give. So, Andrew?
Well, I know we talked about early childhood, but what we're also missing is early childhood family ed staff in Minnesota don't have the same contact as K-12 staff, and when you don't have the same variables, it makes it very hard to retain teachers in ECFE. And so I know there's a push from MNAFA, I think it is, for ECFE to be integrated to K-12.
And that's the rubber hitting the road on that one too, you know. Okay, so other concerns? What we're hearing is teacher recruitment and retention. We found it interesting that our folks from around the state are also saying this is a huge concern for them. Too closely focused on closing gaps and testing. Remember I told you early on they're talking about using the surplus dollars for the education achievement gap. It's not for education, it's for the education achievement gap. It's like that seems to be the constancy that we talk about, and the only way to close the gap is further testing, which is antithetical to what the reality is.
And I'm just going to comment that that's where that well-rounded piece comes in. What parents are saying is we're not having enough well-rounded. We don't have music consistently. We don't have arts consistently at the expense of.
Student mental health is coming up all over the state as well, which we found pretty interesting. Pre-K early intervention, especially for English learners, refugee, and kids living in poverty. So again, many people see this and always go, well, you know, this is an urban issue. These guys are spread throughout, that this is not just our issue. English language cross-subsidy in areas with Betty English language refugee students. So we talk about special ed cross-subsidy. It's the exact same thing for English learners. There is a certain amount of money given for every English learner, but it is capped at 6 years. And if you go further, they still have to provide the services, but they're not paid. Transportation costs in rural areas, this becomes a huge issue all the time. Bemidji is the size of Rhode Island. Bemidji School District is the size of Rhode Island. Just keep it in mind when you think about taking, you know, transporting kids around that particular area. And they're also, I found this very interesting. These are people who are saying they're kind of looking at what is the impact of this federal ESSA with them. So I think Minnesotans are looking for what kind of freedom we could get from this and what else it might bring. But again, we got to focus. What did I tell you from the beginning? This is about an election. This is absolutely about an election.
Yes. Sorry. Testing. Okay. You know, last year, my set of twins and Chance and Chad, they go to Battle Creek Elementary, and then their bus stop is like a block away from our house, and there was a day in, I think it was during November. It was on a Friday. The original bus driver, she let the kids go cross the street, and then cross the street, and then she will go, right? But there was a sub on Friday. Last year on Friday, the kids did not go cross the street yet on the first block, and then the bus driver, he just went right behind them, and then my kids was like, hurry, 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 mom, hurry, and then they went, right? And then we went to the school and talked to the bus transportation, talk about it. And then they said that, oh no, if the bus didn't ran over the kids and the mom, that's okay, right? And then on Monday, it happened at the same place too, and there was the same bus driver. No, and it was the same substitute bus driver again. And then he did again, and then we went back to the school, and then the teachers, he said that no, that's okay. If it's didn't hit, that's okay. And then on Tuesday, I crossed the street. I crossed the first street, and then my kids and my wife, they crossed the other street, and then I crossed the other street too, right? But the bus driver, it was right in front of me, and he came right in front of me, 5 feet away from me, and then I raised my hand, and then I screamed so loud, said, "Stop!" You know. And then the next day, we went and talked to the teacher again, and then they said, well, if the bus driver didn't hit you, that's okay. And then I said, what? You know, I should have sued the bus.
Were you talking to the teacher each time?
Yes.
Okay.
No, the same teacher.
No, I mean, did you talk to the principal of the school?
No,
In a situation
the principal wasn't there.
Right. In a situation like that,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a very specific situation. If you're in a situation like that, that's one of the things, call us. Because I can tell you, what you do is you go to the principal, and you tell the principal you want to lodge a complaint against the bus company. That's the way you do it. Because the teacher sees, no, what am I going to say? Which is unfortunate, because the teacher should have taken you and helped you go to the principal and say you need to lodge a complaint. Because some schools get their own buses and some schools contract with buses. But either way, the school's the one that writes the check. So the school has to lodge the complaint. And that's ripe for having a complaint lodged. I'm so sorry that happened to you. People have said for years, I wish we could do away with having busing, because 95% of our problems are on busing. So that's a scary situation. What are the hot button issues that are going to affect this election? First off, I think how to solve the teacher shortage. We keep talking about it, but I think you've got the alternative license on one end and license reciprocity with other states. Those are, free up the license reciprocity, alternative license. This is what people are talking about, but we're going to have to pay very close attention to them to see how this affects our teachers who are homegrown and coming up through the ranks. I'm also not seeing a lot. People keep telling us the alternative teacher licensure will help us get and recruit more non-white teachers. I'm not seeing that. I just am not seeing that. So I think we have to push back on that one. License reciprocity with another state. This could be something. I came from Illinois and all that good stuff. But now in Wisconsin, haven't they just passed the law that you don't need a license to teach in Wisconsin? So if we had reciprocity with Wisconsin, that means that anybody coming from Wisconsin would be a licensed teacher in Minnesota, but not in Wisconsin. So we have to be very careful with these. How to deal with early learning. This is going to be the other big hot button issue. We talked about universal pre-K. That was what Governor Dayton wanted. Literally, the reason Governor Dayton wanted it, and they had quite a kerfuffle. Wow, kerfuffle. Why would I have difficulty saying that word? He and Speaker Doubt in a panel the other day, because Governor Dayton wants this, and the reason he says he wants this is he says he wants every 4-year-old in a program, not just some 4-year-olds. That's his first reason. His second reason is he wants them in front of a licensed teacher. And the only way he can require that is if they are in a public 4-year-old program. Nobody hears that story, but that's what he says about it. So he's still looking for UPK for those two very specific reasons. The kerfuffle went off when Speaker Dowd said all you're trying to do is increase the numbers of the state teacher union. And it was interesting because Governor Dayton said, and he said very specifically, you're trying to increase the numbers of the state teachers union when they will elect more Democrats. And Governor Dayton turned around and said, so because you think that it means that we'll have more Democrats elected, that's the reason to not allow 4-year-olds into preschool. It was very interesting, and so then Kurt Dowd said that's not the reason. The reason is because it doesn't work. Preschool doesn't work, to which Governor Dayton said, you're wrong. And that's where it ended. So I absolutely believe this is going to continue. But they talk about mixed, Shauna, help me with this, mixed.
Multiple, what?
Systems.
Pardon? What they're trying to do is public school and the private preschools, and find a way to have that kids can go to either, but are all doing exceedingly well by the time they get to kindergarten. By the way, well, I won't go into that. But scholarships, again, back to one-time funding, which would be easiest in this? Could you buy into universal pre-K with one-time funding?
No.
So where would you have to put it? I mean, I think what we're going to see is increased school readiness and scholarships, because both of those you can put one-time money in. So I think the conversation will be about around UPK, but I think the reality will come when the money, if the money comes in those areas. Yeah.
When will we know what money we really have to work with?
We know it now, 900 million. That's the real number.
But that's money that they still will need, though.
Of course, but that's always the way they do it. They say they have 900 million, but they haven't factored in any inflation on expenditures, but they'll still say they have 900 million. Seriously, it's like you're paid on Friday, and over the weekend you have a surplus.
Right. But there will be,
because the bills are going to be paid on Monday.
We'll find out mid-March, right? After March 15th, whether any of this is going to be spent on.
Well, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see what's happening. But the big one that I'm interested in is that everybody talks about creating racial equity in the system. I tell you, we are in the early stages of this conversation, at least legislatively. So I'm not seeing a lot of solid thoughts on this. So that's the one I'm most interested in. How are we actually going to do this? How do we move this through the process? Sean?
Mixed delivery system.
Mixed delivery system, thank you. Public schools, daycares, private providers, it's called a mixed delivery system. Most people are on for that. Higher Ed Learning Commission, this is a big deal, guys, and it's been lost in the weeds. The Higher Learning Commission is now requiring, it's a long, involved story, but let's put it this way. Concurrent enrollment and college in the schools are being provided today by high school teachers. They can provide it. Well, the Higher Learning Commission is saying no more, that a teacher who is going to provide concurrent enrollment or college in the schools needs to have 18 credits in that content area and or a master's in that content area. So there are people, and it's hard to argue with that because they're trying to say you need greater education, but there are people that have taught concurrent enrollment for 20 years. And now they're being told that they have to go back and get a master's in order to teach concurrent enrollment. So there's a lot of schools that are saying we're just not going to provide it anymore. Well, that concurrent enrollment has helped an enormous amount of kids get credentialed. So this is a huge issue. We've been working on this, and now it's stuck at the federal level. So we're hoping the feds will act on this. The Higher Learning Commission is a totally unelected group. They work for the group of colleges that are accredited to teach teachers. So you kind of start saying,
We want money.
Oh, Sarah, such skepticism. But at any rate, we're keeping an eye on this one. And the Minority Leader Thiessen's bill, I loved this. I actually loved this. This is going nowhere, but he's trying to point out the darkness in the last hours, and which is very true. He wants to require at least 24 hours of public availability of the bills before there's a vote. You usually get 10 minutes. Ban policy language from massive budget bills. That would be very interesting for the omnibus bill for education. Enforce the constitutionally required single subject rule in an omnibus bill. These things are not being done here, and he wants to see them done. He's calling this a transparency bill. Like I said, it's not going anywhere, but they're putting their stake in the ground. The legislative timeline, we'll see the governor's budget on 3/15, and this is where it all begins. On March 15th, we'll see if the governor's going to put money, where the governor's going to put money. That's the first shot across the bow. After that, if the legislative leaders decide to provide targets, so decide to take that $900 million and divide it up to the various committees, we'll know that after this. We won't know before that, so we'll see what happens. It's legislative leaders that divide up the money and decide to hand it out. They do that in a budget year. In a bonding year, they don't need to. They can just tell their committees, you're running on no money. If you want to pass policy, try it, but you're running on no money. We'll find that out after this. Then there's going to be a recess. Then the first bill deadline, it has to pass the House of Origin. So if a bill is coming forward and you're trying to get it in, by April 1st, it really has to pass favorably in the House of Origin. So if your bill starts in the House, it's got to get through here. There's a second bill deadline, and that's if you've got a companion bill for it, it's got to pass here. The third bill deadline, these are for any major appropriations. This is where it gets real. This is where it gets really real. If you'll notice, all of those are in less than 3 weeks. That is really tight. That's really tight. Because after March 15th, we'll hear about anything. There's only 2 weeks before that first bill deadline. That's really tight. And then there's another recess right after that. And then sine die on 5/23, which means without day. So they don't have another day for when they meet because this legislature will not meet again. They all leave, and then they all run for office, and the next one that's convened in January of 2017 will be an entirely new configured legislature. We have no idea who will be there. We have no idea who will have control. We know that we'll still have Governor Dayton as the governor, but we won't know who will hold the House and who will hold the Senate. And any bill that's introduced or passed through this year dies. It's done. You have to start all over again next year. Questions on this? Oh, sorry, Rachel wanted to take a picture.
You got it. I just want to say that those recesses are short. They're Friday to Monday recesses.
Yeah,
one's Easter, one's Passover.
Exactly, and that's, they usually take a week off. They didn't have a week to take off. Remember, the Capitol is closed. It is literally closed. It's a very odd view to look at it, but that just means there are hearings in the State Office building and in the Minnesota Senate building. And the Minnesota Senate building is beautiful. It's not lush, it's not overly, but it really is very beautiful, and it's very open to the public, which is nice. All floor sessions will be in the Minnesota Senate building, which will be very interesting. So we'll see what happens. So let's stop there. Questions? Is there anything I said today that you go, I don't understand what you're talking about? Oh, really? I'm that good. Okay, Sarah.
The concept of one-time funding, which I'm just still trying to grasp that.
Okay, let's say you get a bonus in a year. Are you going to get that same bonus next year? Okay, so what are you going to spend your bonus on? Are you going to buy a car that you have to make payments on for the next 10 years? Or are you just going to buy a trip or patio furniture? Something that you just buy that time. That's one-time funding. Paul's leaving, so do you have your information on the coalition? Thanks, appreciate that. Anybody who's interested in decoding dyslexia over here? Other folks? All right, anything else? Anything else? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. We knew we couldn't get away with this.
I waited till the end.
I know.
I'd just like the group maybe to think about another reason why we aren't attracting good, intelligent, thoughtful, caring people into the profession, and that is the issue of safety. And we've had some really high-profile issues of educators who have been permanently injured in the classroom. What we don't see and are the statistics of special ed teachers who are regularly injured and leave because of it. We also don't see the numbers from across the state. But if you think about how discouraging that would be to somebody coming in or thinking about coming in, I think the safety of everyone in schools, including the adults, really should be something that's dealt with. Thank you.
The thing that I've heard that I think is really interesting, I've been asked this question often, would you tell your children to go into teaching? It's an interesting question. This is what Parents United does, but we can't do it alone. We can't, because we can't just stand there and say, yeah, we know what parents are thinking. If you're not reading our updates, if you're not clicking to us, if you're not telling us what's going on, if you're not responding to our tweets or responding to our Facebook pages or sharing what we're doing, the information doesn't get any further than us. It doesn't work. And then I think it's really important, any nonprofit that comes in front of you, please ask them this question first and foremost: who funds them? Because there's an awful lot of grassroots organizations that call themselves grassroots that are not grassroots because they are funded by people outside of Minnesota and definitely have agendas. Our agenda is very clear. We do not speak for you. We try and get you the information so you can speak for yourself. We purposely stopped going for major grants a couple of years ago because we were asked with those grants in accepting the money to also carry the agendas of those foundations. We chose not to. We said, we're here for parents, we're not going to do this. So because of that, we take 30% from any kind of contracts we could get or any kind of dollars that we could get on grants for community engagement. And then 70% of us are funded by people just like you who sit here and give us the $10 a week so that we can provide this information for you. We hold ourselves to this because we need to be independent. We need an independent voice for the parents and the public in Minnesota to take a look at this. We can say what we want because of this funding stream. So be aware of that. Please help us out at any time.
Hi. I just want to say hello also. My name is Eric Celeste, and I'm on the board of Parents United, and there are a number of board members around the room. I wonder if you'd raise your hand so people can see who you are. And we'd like to thank especially Mary and the staff, Shauna, Ann, Lisa, Laura, for all the work that they do to make this possible. But this doesn't happen just because of staff. This really happens because of folks like you in the room. And we need to broaden Parents United's appeal. We need to expose more people to this information, because most people look at the problems in their schools and they look at their teachers and they look at their principals and they don't see much further than that, maybe the school district. And we know that in Minnesota, many of those problems trace back to the legislature, to inadequate funding, to expectations and mandates that are set at the state level and then not properly funded for the schools. We need your help engaging families, helping them deepen their knowledge of the system here in Minnesota so that they can be active and effective advocates. And that doesn't happen for free either. There's a real cost to this. So please, if you haven't already, do take a look at the website, parentsunited.org. and consider donating. Any amount is great. Sustaining donors are especially welcome because we need this as an ongoing expense, not a one-time expense, Parents United. And it's honestly, we're looking at a very tough year to come for Parents United, and we're going to have to think and refocus and be more effective in the work we do too. So we need your help in that, and we need your support, and we need you to help us reach out to others, because there are a lot of families out there who don't know what we learn in this room, and we need to get the message out there. So thank you for coming today, and thank you, Ann, Laura, Lisa, Shauna, and Mary for all the great work you do for us.
If I could add to that, is this on?
It's on.
If I could add to that, I'm also a board member, Julie Schultz-Brown. I think I'm a sustaining member, which just means I give regular each month. It just comes out of my paycheck, even though I don't really have one right now. But it comes out every month at $120 a month, and it's that important to me. If you went to a movie this afternoon, you'd have to pay $10 or something. I wouldn't say just consider giving. There's a box out at the front table. Don't consider giving. Please give. There's nothing more important than our children's education. It's about our children's future. It's way more important than a movie. I know we all give to our churches and other places, but there is just no more important place for us to get this kind of information and share and connect with each other than there's with Parents United. So please do give. Thank you.
If I
Thanks,
could.
Julie.
Yeah. Anne, you want to talk about that?
Oh, I just want to say that most of you got this when you came in, and I just wanted you to know that this is what we told the Senate last week, that we thought their priorities and opportunities are this session. We don't speak for you, but these are issues that we heard collectively. When we keep our eye on the whole thing, and everybody's saying it, then we can get behind things that are research-based and sustainable and about equity. So.
There are more copies back there. And on Thursday, everything starts on Thursday. It starts this Tuesday, but what happens is everybody meets and says hi, and then the next day they go have a retreat. So Thursday is the first real set of meetings. And what's very interesting is the Office of Legislative Auditor has done an audit of the Board of Teaching. So this is all around the alternative licensure, reciprocity, the whole 9 yards. And we got a copy of the OLA's report and the recommendations, and it's going to be a really hot meeting. So there are going to be things that are brought forward here, because one side is saying the Board of Teaching is not doing what it should do. They should open the doors to new teachers and other teachers. Other people are saying they should make it tougher to be a teacher. This is going to be a real kerfuffle. And so that starts Thursday at 8:30 in the Senate, and then I believe it's in the House at
12:45.
12:45. So
Come with me. It'll be fun.
Join us sometime, but you don't have to be there, because if you haven't signed up for our updates every Friday, we will tell you what's going on from our perspective. So thank you for coming, and enjoy your day.
Please feel free to take some Danish home to your people. We have lots and lots of pastries, and we're going to have to throw them away if they don't eat them.
See if I can reach him.